There are almost no games where Donk plays bad, but there is this game where Donk plays not at the Donk level. It is tough because one of the questions I actually noticed recently was, would Spirit even be tier 2 without Donk? And it's a tough question to ask because obviously without Donk they would have Kyosuke, they would probably still be a top 5 team. But if they didn't have either of them, would they even be, well, this is a game where they kind of play without Donk. In fact, it's even worse than that because if you watched my video on Nico recently, you know, Nico has a pretty solid B game. And so when things aren't going well, he plays a little bit more passive. He doesn't give up openings if he doesn't need to. And he tries to play as like a player in the system. Whereas Donk is just so inhumanly consistent at playing the hardest role in the game that he actually, I don't feel like he's got the greatest B game fleshed out yet. Now, that's not to say he eventually won't, but it does feel like when Donk has a bad game, typically he does end up giving away kills, taking engagements that he usually wins, which is totally reasonable. But that means that his team is kind of playing at a relatively large disadvantage, even more so than just the disadvantage they would have with Donk not getting the kills. And you actually saw that Zontix was able to pick up the slack quite often. Zontix even went in on some entry duels and aimed for the head, which is something you don't often see. I guess maybe he's just playing with weights on, aiming for the body, and then decides to aim for the head when Donk's having a bad game. But, I mean, that's a kill that Donk gets 95%. I shouldn't even say 95% of the time. Donk gets that kill like 99% of the time. That's kind of a free kill. Partly watching this series, I'm actually interested in the idea of, like, how much was this Donk playing bad, and how much was this Eternal Fire just absolutely blowing his head off? Because I noticed on map 3, that was the case a large portion of the time, that Donk was just getting absolutely blasted pretty much every time he saw someone. It didn't feel like he really was whiffing that hard, whereas on this map, at least so far, I mean, we've got 2 engagements, he probably wins a good portion of the time. And I think we're going to see a little bit more of that because he does end this with a negative KD. And yet, what's kind of funny about this, though, is that I'm making a video on Donk playing bad, but he was still the highest rated player in the series. It was like a 1.19. And I was planning, actually, after this series, I was planning after their last series, to make Donk can't keep getting away with this because people were making note, and I made note, of Monacy having a really good event at EPL. And the thing is, Monacy had a really good event, but Donk had an even better event. And he's just literally been so good for so long, so consistently game-breaking, that you kind of forget it's even happening. And it's just like, people are talking about G2 with this amazing event, and it's like ZywOo, actually, because people don't talk about ZywOo having really good events very often anymore. Other players having an event nearly as good as them is a very, even great, like Monacy is already one of the top players, but him having an event almost as good as Donk was like very notable, and Donk having a Donk event, it was just like, you don't even notice. It's just nothing. But I mean, Donk so far in this game, 4-3. I don't think you're ever going to see him whiff as hard as you hope. Like, I feel like if you play Counter-Strike, you're really hoping that Donk's going to have a game where he just looks like you whenever you play, and you're like, huh, he is human. It's maybe I'm just waiting for that string of good games and I can eventually become Donk. But he doesn't. He doesn't. But I want to see, like, how much of a disadvantage does he actually put them in, and how much did Zontix actually have to carry in this game or in this series? Because Zontix actually is. Donk ends the series at a +0 in terms of kill death. Zontix is like +7, and Zontix has like almost 7 or 8 more ADR or something like that, but Donk still has a higher rating, which sucks for Zontix. But the problem with Zontix, I'm going to have a video out about this soon, that his T-sides are just kind of weak. CT side, he does a lot, but T-sides, I feel like he struggles really, really often. Anyways, Donk, E-Box player. There was the whole debate, I guess, this event about, is it E-Box, Connector, or Dark? And apparently there's another name that I can't even remember. I've only ever heard E-Box or Connector for the most part. Occasionally I hear Dark, but that's pretty much it. And by the way, just watching this one and seeing Zontix just picking up double headshots left and right. This isn't a Zontix video, but this is what happens. This is what happens when you crouch into Zontix. You just get absolutely destroyed with a headshot. That's part of why it works on CT side. But okay, we're going to ignore ignore Zontics for the rest of this game. Otherwise, it's going to get a little bit... but rotating back in a 3v3, obviously, Donk has the AK. You've got a couple of MP9s. Generally on retakes, you're going to see him go in second. That's probably not a kill that you can find all that consistently. Fair enough. I mean, he only saw a pixel of his opponent, but it does end up leading him into a 1v2 that's more or less unwinnable. Except for maybe, I mean, this is theoretically winnable if you do exactly what he did there, and then Wicadia doesn't trade you, and he can get right back on the bomb. It's just a really tough round to win, but not one that you can actually argue he shouldn't go for, or not one that you can justify if you're in his head. Like, if he's in his own head, you can't really justify saving there, because it's just, you have too much chance to win, even though it just feels kind of hopeless. Really does require Eternal Fire absolutely fumbling, but to be fair, I mean, if you actually watch this series, Eternal Fire absolutely did fumble several clutches, several like 2v4s, 1v3s. They fumbled really reasonably. You could argue pretty fairly, actually, and Major almost said it, but he I think he knew the pushback you get if you say that type of thing. I think Eternal Fire probably was the better team for the majority of this series. For the first two maps on Nuke, they lose. Eternal Fire lose in double overtime, and it depends what you mean by better team. Because from a team perspective, like how they actually played out the rounds, it did feel like Eternal Fire was the better team for the first two maps, but they fumbled just almost unlosable scenarios. But that's kind of what you're thinking about. Like when you look at Eternal Fire, it's the playoffs, and they do struggle in the playoffs. And interestingly, I was actually listening to Flamesy on Talking Counter, talking about he had struggles in the playoffs as well. And what it took is he had a really good event in one playoffs, and from there on out, he felt like he was confident and he could do it, and it wasn't really a problem anymore. And that might be the case for Eternal Fire, where they just need to win an event or like beat Vitality or beat Spirit once, and maybe that can give them the confidence to actually play out these playoff matches a little bit more to the level that they realistically are at the majority of the time. Because especially when you're looking at losing 3v1s, 4v2s, things like that, a lot of the time you lose those not because you're playing like idiots, but because you're trying to play too smart. You're like, oh, this is an important moment. Like I don't know if this is necessarily what they're doing, but I know this has been common in the past. Other teams and players have talked about this. You try to be too smart. You try and make sure we don't give up any opportunity for them to make the clutch. And in doing so, you end up actually leaving openings that you don't realize, or just giving up too much space, or making peaks that don't make sense because of that. It's actually somewhat counterintuitive. But anyways, Donk already with 1 kill in this round. He's not like hard whiffing or anything. This is a Donk bad game seems to be like a Snacks life game. I'm sorry, Snacks. Like a Hooks. I'm sorry, Hooksy. It looks to be like a normal game-ish in terms of level for most average players. But that's kind of the mythos of Donk at this point, right? And some of it obviously is going to be he's dead to a nade, he gets insta-gibbed once or twice in this game. The reality is that he's not going to have the most opportunities, but also part of it is you create your own opportunities to some extent, right? So if he's just not making plays at the right timings, then you could question if that's bad luck or if that is kind of, you know, his just internal clock, his internal timer rather is off on some of the plays that he thinks his opponents are making, those types of things. Because one of the things Donk is crazy good at is spamming smokes, especially because he just has a really good read for the timing that people will be walking through them or the plays that people will be making. Like, I think Donk's game sense is actually pretty massively underrated. But okay, Behold, except it's just a fake, so they throw a bit of counter utility. Donk tosses the flash out, which makes the T's then have to worry that Donk is like pushed out and retaken B main control if they had evacuated, but they didn't, so they're aware. And a lot of the time you see that type of thing, and you might even consider going back to B because you know that they faked control. That might mean they're faking, like, you know, they're stacked in the other direction. In fact, there was a Monacy clip from Inferno against Maus where they talk about something fairly similar in terms of timings and expecting plays to come out based on a very specific timing. But Donk on the actual site hold, they have the stack. He does get the initial kill, and his opponents are completely focused on him. And then he tries to double peek with Magics, but it just doesn't work out. And I mean, when Woxic's just sitting there posted on you and he hits the first shot, someone's going to have to die. Now, usually you probably if you're Spirit, you want that to be Magic that gets killed by the op, but you have 3 players there staring at you. It's actually the player on the other side. I think it was it Chopper or Shiro that went through with the FAMAS? That's the player that actually either has to come through a little bit earlier if you expect them to all to be looking the other direction, or you bait them to look in your direction on the right side, and then you come through that smoke and you hope they can clean up, and it just didn't work out that way, right? And then we have Donk go for the aggressive play, and Xantarez is one of the players that has, I mean, I feel like Donk struggles against a certain couple of players, the primary one being Nico. He struggles a little bit. It feels like Xershin gets the better of Donk in the head-to-head a reasonable amount of the time. He definitely did around the time that, you know, Maus actually did beat Spirit once or twice in the previous year. And Xantarez is a player that, if you're thinking of like the Nico-style gameplay, Xantarez is one of those players that definitely could shut Donk down, just from the perspective of Donk makes a lot of really aggressive plays, and a lot of those plays aren't necessarily going to be like plays where he's taking advantageous gunfights, but he's so good at winning disadvantageous gunfights that he can actually afford to take those fights. But then you run into Nico, and that seems to be the problem. Donk makes those plays against Nico, and Nico just insta one bullet headshots him and doesn't give him a real chance. And Xantarez could be a little bit of the same. And again, I noticed that a bit on Mirage, but on Anubis, I mean, Donk hasn't gotten a lot of opportunities. I mean, he's walked into an op a couple of times, but didn't really have a choice, really kind of had to walk into the op. He's lost a couple of duels, but he loses a couple of duels once in a while. He just hasn't been insta one bullet headshotting people quite to the same degree he often does. But pistol round, mostly going to fast forward through this. I mean, it's a pistol round. I don't think I really care all that much, and he gets absolutely destroyed. And I'm surprised actually to see them force on this round. A lot of the time I noticed that, it's actually on the CT side where they mostly save, I think, on the second round. Or no, I think in the Vitality Spirit series, it was T side. If they didn't plant the bomb, they saved. I think 2 of the 3 games they lost when they got 3-0'd in the final were losses on T-Pistol and then a save. But they would save, and I noticed they were actually... Let me double check. One of the things I noticed a couple of times was that there was a player that didn't buy, and maybe it was like a misbuy, but I actually thought it might have been, and it didn't happen in this game, but it might have been that they were saving, and this is crazy to even consider, but it would often be that you would have 4 Glocks and Donk with a Deagle, and I thought, is that player saving so that they can afford to give Donk a Deagle without actually having a lack of utility in the following round? And that, like, are they proving every silver right that you shouldn't full invest and you should instead play for round 2? Which, no, you shouldn't, okay? Definitely not, but I actually wanted to, I forgot that I wanted to take a look into that because I just saw Spirit doing it so much with Donk with a Deagle and 4 Glocks, right? And I mean, the problem is that Donk with a Deagle just does so much work that he actually gives his team such an insane chance to win the round, because he gets a Deagle kill, you collect the gun, and you have, I mean, then you potentially have Donk with an AK, or, well, it wouldn't be an AK, but, you know, with an M4, or you have Zontix with an M4, Donk with a Deagle, and you actually have a reasonable chance of winning the round. But regardless, that's not actually what happened. They go for the reforce because they're down 11-3 already. Donk on the trade narrowly gets the kill on a walk, taking 99 damage. And you would probably, I mean, it's tough because you probably think he should be trading for the Tech 9, but the problem is Donk is never killing anyone if he has a Tech 9 and 1 health. But still, the odds of you killing someone, if you have an AK, at least it's a 1 bullet headshot, but so long as you're going to have to take multiple bullets to kill your opponent, you're probably not getting any kills if you have 1 HP, right? But into the 2v3, Donk does get a kill, and Zontix doesn't get a kill with the Galil he was given. So maybe next time Donk's supposed to keep it. Nah. But Donk does move back into smoke, pick up the Galil, and this is a really great idea in general. Is that a rule that can be followed pretty effectively? Is that when you're low HP, and this is true like if you're high ping as well, is essentially just don't hold angles, because if they peek into you, they're just going to get a shot off, and even if they don't, I mean, they're going to be pre-aiming reasonably unless you're at an insane off angle. The odds of them getting a shot off and hitting you at least once are near 100%, right? But if you peek into someone else or you make a play they're not expecting, you do actually give yourself the opportunity. Maybe you just get absolutely destroyed and they're just staring right at the angle, but you have 1 HP. That's not a big deal. You're expected to die. Whereas if you make a play through a smoke, you go for a peek onto an opponent, then you actually have a reasonable, like a realistic chance to land a shot quickly enough that your opponents don't actually get to fire back at you. But anyways, Donk with some support. Almost let Wicadia get away there. I mean, almost actually died to Wicadia. That's like a 20th bullet AK edge shot, which is not what you usually expect. Is it? He's 20th bullet? It was only 10 bullets? It felt like forever, man. But then the speed at which his Spirit is in T-spawn looking to kill the players saving on Eternal Fire is actually wild. They're in like deep T-spawn, not even that long after the bomb is planted, and Major's like, hold up, what the hell am I looking at in T-spawn right now? Why are there 2 players here? But alright, Chopper, first death, and actually you have Jota, he saved the AK from the previous round, takes down Chopper. They don't actually get the control with that, so they have to go back into something, and as Spirit, they're just going to gamble that Eternal Fire were probably going back into A control rather than B control. That kill on Xantarez makes you question it for a second. If you're Spirit, you're like, oh shit, are they 5-stacking here? It's actually the A flank, and they get the perfect timing because at least Donk doesn't get taken down, so you turn it into a 3v3. And interesting, like very disciplined save from Eternal Fire. In a 3v3, it's not unwinnable, but the problem is they know where all 3 of your players are, so yeah, actually it's pretty much unwinnable. I mean, if you could imagine a CT side that could defend B, but they also knew that nobody was outside B, they would just like, there's too many crossfires. I feel like a lot of teams do go for those types of unwinnable retakes, though, a decent amount. But in this case, I mean, you're up 11-6. There's no real crunch for you to get the rounds immediately. Just give yourself the best opportunity to get rounds over time, right? Let yourself keep that AK, build up a bit of economy. You can look at their money right now is actually not nearly as bad as it would be if they went in and died. But then you have what is like an attempted kind of B-pop style play. Donk, I don't know, I feel like he probably gets that kill most of the time. But I'm more interested in the pathing on this round, because this looks kind of odd. You actually have Chopper throwing these flashes that are going to bounce off and land pretty low to blind a lot of people in, I think you might even blind someone in E-Box, but definitely anyone in these areas, which Eternal Fire regularly stays in because they try and re-aggress after these smokes go down. The point seems to be to deal with these players. And you even have Shiro here that can deal with someone back sight, but as they go in, Magix is going to get full blinded by the first flash, and Donk is trying to swing out wide left, which is like, I think a pretty common pathing to make into the bomb site. However, that seems to be different than what the plan is on that strat. It just seems a little bit weird to me, like they're not on the same page, or they're thinking it's a different play or something. Or I think what really happened is the strat got thrown off a little bit because the Donk made contact before they're supposed to, or before they're really expecting to. And then Spirit just end up in a 3v4. I mean, Zontix does get out onto the A site. It's a free kill onto Zontix, or onto Jota, I mean, with the nade onto site. Zontix gets all the way into site, turns into a 3v3. This is actually, Zontix's lurking on this map was incredibly effective at turning some rounds like these back into their favor, like giving them a chance at some rounds where they otherwise just... Shiro really didn't even notice the player at the bottom of the screen there, did he? Is he a centimeter away from his monitor, Yekindar style? What the hell? But okay. Going for the canals play. Nade does an unbelievable amount of damage. Not only that, but Shiro is also quite injured. So although they're 5v4, not the healthiest of 5v4s. At the same time, though, Eternal Fire don't know that. Like, they might know some damage was done onto Shiro, but they probably have no idea that a bunch of extra damage was done with that nade. It's just unconfirmed damage, so you can't actually play off of it. I was interested in this round because Eternal Fire, I don't think do they full clear this? Yeah, they don't full clear the close right. And maybe they just have an idea that Spirit don't usually get a player into that position or something like that. Because I think there's a couple of times in this game where that angle isn't cleared and someone inside of there just gets themselves a free kill. But Donk with 50 HP, playing this one pretty safe. I mean, just jiggling constantly until about 20 seconds left in the round. Then they're going to have to bust their way out onto the B site. And Donk, I mean, because of that earlier nade damage, gets absolutely destroyed. He's also trying to force it pretty quickly there because of the situation, because there's so little time left and the guy's kind of trapped in the back site. I mean, it's a pretty nice kill from Jota. Not sure that Donk he would have had to play that differently for a different outcome, I think. He didn't really have much of a chance to get that kill. This is the buy where if you're Eternal Fire, you're starting to get a little bit worried. I mean, 12-8, you're hoping to win this one here. Otherwise, once the CTs get into double digits, then the panic starts to set in. Then the comeback could actually be on, and people start to get a little bit nervous. The thing is, I'm thinking double digits, but double digits is more like an MR15 thing. I mean, 12-8 is probably a scoreline where you're starting to get worried because you're really only a couple of gun rounds away from going into overtime. I mean, this time around, what happens? Zontix and Donk go towards an A hit. Woxic is just holding the angle, very, very prepared for that type of play. One of them's going to have to walk into it. Turns out it's Donk, and then Zontix just goes on for the double entry on the B site. Yeah. Not much that can be really said about that. And honestly, not much that can be said that's that negative about Donk's performance in this game in general. Like, based on the first few rounds, you can see Donk definitely wasn't having one of his best games. His aim wasn't on point the way it usually is. But at the same time, he hasn't really missed too many like freebies. He's mostly only missed kills where it's like, yeah, Donk pretty much gets those the majority of the time, but at the same time, like, most players aren't getting those consistently the way Donk generally will, and he's not really given up too many free kills that aren't like kind of part of the strat, right? Like, he's going into E-Box trying to take control, or with the previous round with Zontix, they're trying to take, control of A main. He's the one that gets caught out because the op is just in the right position at the right time, and sometimes you can't really necessarily avoid that. Maybe there's an idea behind it to, what Donk's most common plays are. People talked about this with Vitality, where maybe Vitality knew a lot of the angles that Donk was likely to be at, and they were chipping him down with nades almost every round. And if you could counter-strat Donk that effectively, then go for it. But I don't think it's quite as easy as as that, right? This is an interesting one. Shiro, I thought he was actually going to take the aggressive peek and try and duel against Major there. But he actually, I mean, in typical Opper fashion, right? What you want is you want your rifler to bait out the shot so you can post up on the repeat and you can punish the mistake, which is exactly what he does. And you have a 13-10 game. And hate it all you want, dread it, run from it. Donk finally has a bad game, but it's not even a bad game. It's like a mediocre game, and Spirit still win.